Minority Vulnerability in Twin City Neighborhoods by Jacob Pauna. This project had a couple goals, and they were learn about the many aspects of vulnerability, as in spatial mismatch, green space, arsenal of exclusion, etc., get a better understanding of issues in the Minnesota metro area, and finally choose a specific issue that you're interested in to study and present about it. My initial project focus was on two aspects of vulnerability: demographic vulnerability and proximity to amenities, which in my case meant green space. While exploring the data, I realized that a map simply displaying percent minorities had patterns similar to those of demographic vulnerability and amenities. With that in mind, I decided to focus on the vulnerability of minorities within the 7-county metro area. I also found some articles that were related to my topic. The first article I found was called Green Space, Urbanity, and Health: How Strong is the Relation? Many studies, including this one, have shown that proximity to green space can help improve a person's health as well as how they perceive their health. Proximity to parks, rivers, and other green space in urban areas has been shown to benefit people even more in urban areas than rural, and it can even cancel out some of the negative effects of urban life. I felt that this was very related to my topic. The second article I found was called Open Space, Residential Property Values, and Spatial Context. In this study, the prices of housing near these green spaces is examined in the Minnesota metro area while taking into account surrounding neighborhood conditions. They found that proximity to green space increases the prices of housing nearby in most cases. When they compared urban prices to rural prices for proximity, they found that urban pricing could be up to 3 times above the average housing price. The third article I found was called Using a GIS-Based Network Analysis to Determine Urban Green Space Accessibility for Different Ethnic and Religious Groups. This study, performed in Leicester, England, endeavored to see whether or not minorities and certain religious groups had less access to green space. Using GIS and statistical analysis, they followed some local guidelines of what proximity to nature was considered to find their answers. These guidelines were called the Accessible Natural Green Space Standards, or ANGST for short. They found that while it wasn't as bad as it could be in their town of Leicester, certain minority groups did in fact have less access to parks and other green space. Even if the city worked more on improving and expanding their green space areas, due to the high demand for it, housing prices may still rise in these newly green areas, pushing out the lower income families and undermining the goal of the whole process. So after choosing my topic and reading some related articles, I posed my first research question: are the locations of minorities spatially autocorrelated with my definition of vulnerability, aka demographic vulnerability and amenities? And finally, after a lot of data exploration and some model building, I created some maps that visually displayed this possible correlation. This slide shows the data that I used throughout the project. That includes the American Community Survey 5-year summary file created by the U.S. Census Bureau, Land Use 2010 data created by the Metropolitan Council, National Land Cover Data 2011 created by Multi-Resolution Land Characteristics Consortium, Census 2010 Geography created by the U.S. Census Bureau and the Met Council, and Zillow Neighborhood Boundaries created by Zillow. I used these in a multitude of ways throughout the project, and they are very helpful. First of all, this is a map showing the percent minorities across the metro area. To find these numbers, I used the attribute field %white and then created another attribute field that displayed the opposite numbers, aka percent minorities. With this map in mind, I compared the patterns seen here to my two types of vulnerability. And in the right corner right there is the model that I used to create this map. The first factor of vulnerability I focused on was demographic vulnerability. My definition of demographic vulnerability included 3 factors: poverty rate, whether a person had a high school diploma or not, and proximity to vacant lots, which you can see in my model here. Using raster calculator, I created one raster that showed how high an area's vulnerability was based on all 3 of these factors here. On the left is the map of demographic vulnerability that I created. As seen in the 2 maps, The areas with high percent minorities appears to have a relatively similar looking pattern to that of high demographic vulnerability. This seemed especially evident to me in the downtown Twin Cities area, which I have circled. The second factor of vulnerability that I focused on was amenities, meaning access to green space. So, to show this, I used the cost distance tool on parks, water, and golf courses. Next, I brought in a raster of tree coverage. Then, after reclassifying them, I used Raster Calculator to create one raster that displayed proximity to all these features. The map on the left is the amenities map that I created. While these two maps are less visually obvious at first, there still appears to be a connection. Once again, I noticed a possible correlation between the two variables in the downtown Twin Cities area. In the amenities map, the area with large minorities is strikingly darker than some of the surrounding areas, as seen in the circle once again. The periphery areas that appear to have the most difficult access are actually agricultural lands, which I suppose is a type of green space, but I did not include it in my model, thus the darker color in that area. Another interesting relationship I noticed was between my minorities map and this map here on the left, which is from the housing study article I talked about earlier. The map here shows housing prices, with above average housing prices in black and below average in white. I thought it was interesting how the same area that is largely minorities also had a lot of low-income housing. The fact that all of these negative things that I've noticed all fall into the same swath of area seemed like it pointed to a strong case for spatial autocorrelation. At this point of the project, I brought in statistics to see if there really was any correlation between the location of minorities and these vulnerable areas. So, the research question that I posed was, does ordinary least squared linear regression show that the variables are correlated? First, using the tool's zonal statistics as table, I looked at the statistical data for my three variables. Then, using the join tool, I added the mean numbers to the proper shapefile, bringing me to the point where I could finally perform ordinary least squares, or OLS, linear regression on my variables. I decided here to use the municipalities rather than the full counties to get a better idea of how each city fared for vulnerability. After running the OLS for my two vulnerability types, I looked at the R-squared values, which more or less tell how correlated the two variables are the closer the resulting number is to 1. I was surprised to find very unimpressive numbers for both variables. Minorities and demographic vulnerability, which I thought was the strongest case, was at a measly 0.01, while minorities and amenities was about 0.1. It occurred to me that at the city level, there was a lot of variety of the people that lived there, meaning that because I used the mean data for the municipalities, that the extremes within each boundary would average out. So, from there I decided to narrow down my search field a bit. It occurred to me that in all the maps I had made thus far, I had been pointing to the Twin Cities area as having the strongest evidence of correlation anyways. So, I decided to narrow down my area of interest to the Twin Cities alone. To stop the results from being skewed by city size once again, I decided to use the neighborhoods within St. Paul and Minneapolis as boundaries. After rerunning the previous processes I had performed from the municipalities, I reran OLS on my revised area of study. These models simply show how I used the tool zonal statistics as table on each of my variables for both OLS attempts. It turned out that the second round of OLS gave the numbers I was expecting from the first try, especially in regards to demographic vulnerability. The maps on the left show just how similar the patterns of demographic vulnerability in minorities is within the Twin Cities, and the scatter plot on the right shows the positive trend between the two variables. With an R-squared value of 0.53, it shows that there is relatively strong chance that where there are more minorities, there's a higher chance of vulnerability. On the municipal level, the R-squared was only 0.01, so the fact that it went all the way up to 0.53 has troubling implications. For amenities, The r-squared value did go up, but only from zero point 0.1 to zero point 0.2. While there is still some correlation between minorities and less access to amenities, it appears that overall the Twin Cities have pretty good access to green space, even in neighborhoods that are largely minorities. The maps on the right visualize this slight relation pretty well and show the distribution of green space. Project conclusions. While on the city scale, there is not much statistical correlation between location of minorities and areas of vulnerability, I found that on the neighborhood level of the Twin Cities specifically, that there is indeed statistical significance. For minorities and demographic vulnerability, there is spatial autocorrelation there, indicating that there are certain neighborhoods where quality of life is not as good for the minorities that live there. On a more positive note, overall, it looks like access to green space amenities is relatively good in the metro area as a whole, with there being a bit less access in the suburbs. Still, it is important for studies like this to continue to happen, so that cities can work to improve the lives of their inhabitants no matter what their ethnicity is. Limitations. I didn't have any articles that focused on demographic vulnerability, which turned out to be the more correlated variable of the two. Next time, it would be interesting to see what others have found before I do my study. Also, I didn't use as detailed information as the Leicester study did for its definition of minorities, as in a specific ethnic group or even a religious group. Also, I didn't have any detailed guidelines for green space, while they had the angst guidelines. Ideas for further study. Possibly, in another study they could use health data to look at overall health problems in minority-concentrated areas as well. They could see if there really is a relationship between health and some of the other vulnerability variables that I took a look at. There could also be further studies that focus on how to fix the problem discovered in this and other studies, so that people in the future are less vulnerable than they are now.